This is Brian Page, and this is the Earn and Invest podcast.
Manliness. It is actually something I've struggled with my whole life. As a kid, I was often soft and sensitive while the other boys were hard and tough. As I got older, I had little or no proclivity for sports. Even after getting married, I often forfeited typical male roles to my wife. She always drives. She's more likely to fix something around the house. For a while there, my job and my salary felt a little more traditional. I was the better wage earner. I held the title for professional acclaim. Until, of course, I dropped it all to become an underpaid author and podcaster. And yet, through all this, I am convinced that I am becoming not the outcast, but the norm. Engaged men playing sometimes supportive roles, becoming modern fathers, becoming modern husbands. Brian Page spent 15 years as a personal finance and economics educator. He was recognized as a National Educator of the Year by the Milliken Foundation, a CNN Money hero, and a former working group member of the U.S. President's Advisory Council on Financial Capability. He has spent his career improving lives through personal finance education and founded the Modern Husbands platform to continue doing this important work. Brian Page, welcome to Earn and Invest. Let's start at the beginning. What defines manliness in 2024?
Ooh, that's not a chicken soup question, is it? Um, I feel like that, 50 years ago, that was a pretty easy answer to provide and protect. And if you fast forward today, in my view, it's pretty similar. It's just how men provide is more broad. It isn't limited to just making money. Men can provide for their spouses by not just bringing home bacon, but also providing the kind of atmosphere that their spouse needs to be able to bring home bacon themselves, to be able to come home or work from home in an environment that fosters teamwork, where she doesn't feel like she has to shoulder the burden of managing the home by herself. And when you look at the research on what makes women happier and men in marriage, a lot of it boils down to their ability to manage money together, but also to ensure that there's an equitable division of labor at home. So both couples can thrive in the workforce.
Do you think this broadening of the role that men play has caused a crisis in men and boys today? Because we hear about this a lot, the kind of man or boy crisis. Do you buy into this?
I think everybody's different. I, in my circle of friends, what and within our community, what we often hear when we're asked about uh, our role in the home is it's more of like a shoulder shrug. Like if she makes more money, we don't really care. I mean, I was the breadwinner for a long time. My wife is the breadwinner now, and we never in our relationship allowed money to be some sort of value marker in who we are as a spouse. Uh, so for most of us, where most of my friends are college graduates and their partners are college graduates, obviously in a world where it's changing in the labor force, women are earning more, the gender pay gap is closing. This is becoming more common, and that doesn't mean there aren't challenges. When you look at the research shared in Boys and Men by Richard Reeves from Brookings Institute, there is a crisis for boys who, in particular, are not college educated, and that makes me sad because, unfortunately, in our world, the educational attainment that we have has, I believe, too much weight in the happiness of our lives. And I worry about young boys and young men who are in this position. And I feel like that we are in our world right now kind of going through a shakeup that is creating some unfair and unnecessary pain for those boys and those young men.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. And I start to think about what boys have to look forward to, right? And this role that I think we grew up with, certainly in the 70s and 80s, right? That men were the high income earners. They were kind of the strong one who did the work around the house, a lot of what my introduction talks about, versus what seemed like traditionally female roles. What hits me is this role of husband has maybe changed a lot over the years. And in some ways, and it's a very difficult conversation, I start to wonder what the role gender plays in the role of husband. Like, I used to think back in the 80s, for instance, that being a husband was a very gendered thing, right? That's something that a man does. It's a specific set of manly roles. And I almost wonder if that no longer connects. Like what we, from a gender standpoint, say as being a man, which connects to being a husband, doesn't connect anymore. Like the husband's role isn't necessarily those things that we would have called quote unquote manly in the past.
I feel like that for some couples, that that evolution isn't some sort of like big picture progression in society, but it's just a natural slippage into a relationship where they knew exactly what they were getting into. So let me give you an example. One of my Modern Husbands Advisory board members is married. He has a great job. He has a big job, but his wife is an ER surgeon at the busiest hospital in New York City that sees the most gunshot victims. Now he knew what he was getting into. That's not just a big job. That's the kind of job that when you come home from work, if you've had a bad day, it's because someone's died in your arms. And so he recognizes that to support his spouse, he needs to ensure that the home feels like an escape from all of that stress and tension. And that's not a gender thing for him. That's just what he fell in love with. I have another buddy who it was more of a progression, but he's also on our advisory board, Dan Cadlick. And here's a guy who was one of the most renowned financial journalists in the world. He was on Oprah for his financial journalism. And his wife is a rock star. They're living in Europe right now because she was global chief marketing officer, or is, for Visa. And when their careers both took off, there was a point where she really exploded and was making a boatload of money. And his perspective, which is like mine, is sweet. This is great. We
This is
just look at it.
amazing.
This is great. We just look at it really practically like, okay, I'll be the flexible one. I'll work from home. I'll take care of doctor's visits. It's fun being around the kids. I mean, we're obviously working, but we we love it. There's for us, there's no sort of inner turmoil because our wives are crushing it in the labor force. But I realize that that's not always the case because all too often money and marriage or money and masculinity are married.
You know, it's interesting because I think about that viewpoint. Money and masculinity are married. And I think about my own upbringing and the modeling I received. My dad was a doctor and oncologist, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. She actually had been going back to business school to get her MBA when he died suddenly when I was 7. And so the model I have for most of growing up is a very strong working mother who was our financial future, right? She was everything. And so it makes sense that I have become who I am today in some sense that a strong woman who makes a lot of money is not scary to me. That's actually what I'm used to from growing up. I'm interested in what your childhood looked like, such that you've ended up starting this platform, Modern Husbands Today, holding some of the ideas you have today. Did you grow up with a more traditional household? What was the husband role that you grew up with as a kid?
So my dad grew up in a lot of poverty, and so the idea of frugality was a central part of our upbringing. My dad was a computer engineer, but he also owned rental property, so he worked all the time. My mom graduated from Ohio State with honors in 3 years before, and this was before the days of like graduating high school with 2 years of college credits, right? Like it was unheard of for this to happen. She was really smart. And she was a special education teacher. She was very passionate about it. And when I was 7 years old, we were in a tornado, and my mom was permanently disabled from that, and so she had chronic pain. It also triggered multiple sclerosis, and for most of my childhood, she did all she could to shield us from that. She continued to work through the pain. She eventually did go on disability just after I left the household. And so growing up, what I saw was, a mother who was, a fierce worker. My father was a fierce worker, and we all pitched in probably a little bit more than other kids because, my mom was constantly exhausted. So, you know, preparing meals on her own wasn't a big deal. Like I actually love to cook. My brother's loves to cook, and he's an excellent cook. I'm getting there. I'm working on it. So I think that, seeing a woman in my life growing up who was brilliant, that was a worker, but not just that, she did not fit this typical soft, feminine kind of personality. She was fierce. She was the one that I really feared. Um, and I see that amongst a lot of other men who share my views as well, where they grew up either with a single parent or a mother who was a high achiever. And there are certainly instances, and I've seen this kind of out and about at events, where a mother perhaps would, in her time, would have been that doctor, like my grandmother. She graduated second in her class. She was brilliant. She would have been a doctor like my cousin is, but it was before that was normal for women. And when women that are in their 60s and 70s talk to you, you can see they feel like they missed out on something in life. And their children often feel and hear that message, and you can see it in the way that they have relationships with their spouses.
It's interesting. You mentioned the fact that your mother waited until you were out of the house to go on disability. It sounds like she was very cognizant of modeling for you this behavior of what a strong woman looks like.
Could have been. Yeah, yeah, she was gritty. Yeah, she's somebody where, uh, I'm glad that she was a teacher because she was a great teacher and the world needs those. But if she would have been an executive, she would have been probably just as good, if not better, because she's the kind of person that chew your arm off to make sure you got the winning deal. Um, and and my wife in many ways is that way too. I guess I don't know, perhaps it is from my upbringing that an important part of for me and in looking at women is, the fact that I respect them first as human beings, probably because of that upbringing. I don't have kind of this perspective of looking at a woman through a traditional lens, thinking that she should be a homemaker, which I'm going to be clear, there's nothing wrong with being a homemaker, nothing wrong with that whatsoever. It's just not what I grew up experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, I see why you and I maybe hold some of these very similar views based on our upbringings of having the modeling of having a father who was aggressive and involved, but very much accepted marrying a very strong woman who was engaged in the workplace. Not everyone obviously grew up with that, right? Lots of people grew up with much more of a traditional household and yet are seeing the world change in front of them. Your platform is called Modern Husband. First and foremost, what is a modern husband today? What does that mean to you?
Many of us are busy dual career couples who see a marriage as teamwork. And that's an egalitarian relationship that is necessary if both spouses have significant career ambitions, if you have a family, meaning, I shouldn't say it that way, if you have children, because when both spouses work, uh, it's a lot. But when both spouses work and then children are involved, you can't, it's difficult for both for both partners to be happy if one partner is doing a heck of a lot more at home than the other. And it's in many instances it's unfair. And most partners want to be involved with their children as well. I always have. And in order to maximize the time we have with our kid, we need to find systems to put into place in the home, managing money, where we're productive there too. So we can aspire to have our own independent leisure time that's fair and to ensure that we're there for our children.
I've heard you now multiple times use the word teammate or team. And in fact, on your site, you mentioned teammate husband. Are modern husband and teammate husband interchangeable, or is there more to it than that? Is that one of the points, or is it the point?
When that's a good question. That is the point. When I initially decided to do this, uh, I purchased modernhusbands.com. And I was surprised that modernhusbands.com was available, but I reluctantly did so because I don't want people to believe that I see a partnership as only marriage. Um, it's really partnership. But unfortunately, there's all kinds of misunderstandings around partnerships. People might think you're talking about a business partnership. But if you say husband, everybody knows what that means. Like that translates into everything. And like what you said is the word husband and teammate, they really are interchangeable in what we're trying to accomplish.
That definitely begs the question then, does it really matter what gender the people are? In other words, so let's say we have a modern kind of I shouldn't say modern. Let's say we have a traditional relationship, a man and a wife. We've kind of defined modern husband. Is there such thing as modern wife too? Or when we're saying modern wife, we're really talking about modern partner?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I felt most comfortable sharing wisdom through kind of my own experiences first, as at least an opportunity to take those experiences as just kind of like a threshold. And then after that, you'll notice everything I share is evidence-based, right? I'm an academic first. I don't feel like that my experiences are the same as anybody else's, but at least I feel comfortable saying that. Now, um, we do make the point to be very clear that we are a diverse group. We are an open group. For example, David and John from the Queer Money podcast, and they have a Yahoo Live weekly. I think it's on Wednesdays. They're on my advisory board because we want to make sure everybody understands we're not just talking about a man and a woman. We could be talking about a man and a man or any kind of gender dynamic.
And not only that, but again, one of the points I think that I'm finding from this conversation is you have a duo and there aren't two separate roles. It almost seems like there's one role that both people need to play. In other words, we're talking about what it being a modern husband is, but it sounds like if we're going to go with the traditionally gendered roles of husband and wife, that being a modern husband is kind of the same thing as being a modern wife too. Like the specifications or the requirements sound like the same regardless if you're the man or the woman. Does that make sense? Like I almost feel like
Absolutely.
it's almost like I get it. You're a man and I think there is more of a crisis in men. So branding yourself as modern husband makes a lot of sense because I feel like at least on the man side we're struggling with this more. But when we're really describing the role, it doesn't matter who plays the role. It's more like how to be a good partner, regardless of who you are in the relationship.
Absolutely. And if you were to take a list of 1,000 items necessary to run a home and to manage money together, you would just sit down with your partner with that list and you would divide it up in a way where it best suits your skill sets, your passions, and in a way where you both have the same amount of leisure time. And so, in doing that, you really are approaching it as a partnership.
How much of this is a money conversation per se? Because we've talked about money quite a bit already, but I feel like there's accessory parts to that, right? There's things like chores, there's things like childcare, there are things that maybe aren't specifically like who is the person making the money. How much of this is strictly a money conversation?
Yeah, so there's a few things here. I think the first thing to point out is uh, that you in a dual career home, uh, there is an analogy that I was shared with me a few weeks ago by Dr. Zygmunt that I fell in love with. You're going to have a gardener and a rose. And the rose is whomever's career is taking the priority right now in the home. The gardener is the one that is providing the nourishment to ensure the rose can bloom. And just because somebody's a rose now doesn't mean they're going to be a rose in 10 years. Just because somebody's a gardener now doesn't mean they're going to be the gardener in 10 years. Those roles can change. Though that's a practical way in explaining how to manage a home where both partners have a lot of responsibilities. But when you bring up money, there's two angles that I want to talk about. The first is the income side, and this is really important. I want to make sure I get this across to the listeners. The research here is really clear. If you place a financial value on yourself, and that is a value that you believe should give you more weight in your marriage, you are doomed for failure. That is clear in the research. I slipped into a relationship where that was never the case. I didn't read anything about it. I just never did it. My wife doesn't do it. And so when you look at who the breadwinner is, that should not have play a role at all in how money is controlled. Now managing money and controlling money are two different things. The control of the money is the journey and then the destination of where you and your spouse want to go. And managing money is the person who's actually moving the money around that is in line with what that journey looks like that you established with your partner. That's moving money around to make sure that you're getting to that destination, that dream that you've established with your partner. So you can have somebody in a relationship who knows very little about that other than they're kept informed about the circumstances, and the other partner could be doing all of the actual labor involved in managing money. That's how it is in our home.
We are talking to Brian Page, who spent 15 years as a personal finance and economics educator. He was recognized as National Educator of the Year by the Milliken Foundation, a CNN Money hero, and a former working group member of the U.S. President's Advisory Council on Financial Capability. And we are talking today about being a modern husband. We're going to take a short break. I'm Doc G, and this is the Earn and Invest podcast. All right, I'm going to read us back in a moment. Questions, problems, issues?
Is this the direction you want to go? Is this okay?
Yeah. Excellent.
Great.
Just keep doing your thing, and I'm happy.
Great.
All right. Let's read it back in then on three, two, one. We are back with Brian Page. He has spent his career improving lives through personal finance education and founded the Modern Husbands platform to continue doing this important work. Brian, let's talk a touch more about gender roles. I've been watching Bill Maher lately, and
Okay.
he sometimes, when he talks about specifically sexual relationships, sexual orientation, he complains that sometimes men don't want to be men anymore. And he's like, there is a place for some of that traditional manliness behavior. Let's make it benign, right? The holding the door open for the car and some of those kind of traditional um, things that we were taught to do as men. I would bring this to the conversation of being a modern husband. Is there still a role for some of that traditional, and I guess I would say even gendered behavior? Like, is it still kind of cool for the guy to grab the door for the woman?
Okay, so I'm going to speak only for myself. I'm from a rural Ohio area, and you hold the door open, If you're dating, you pay at least early on, you pay for the first date.
But this doesn't contrast with some of what you've now, you've entered a relationship, you got married to someone who was, very successful financially, can hold her own weight, could pay for her own
Sure.
meals on a date. So you don't feel, and I'm not trying to challenge you on here, but I want to be clear because I struggle with these same things. It doesn't feel incongruent to still kind of
No,
have some
no,
of that. Yeah.
not to me. And I've learned, that it's like there's like this spectrum of where men feel their role should be. And I I don't want to judge people who are deeply progressive that do not believe they should hold a door open for a woman because the woman would not like it. Like those are the kinds of, I think, individual choices that are ultimately going to derive from your upbringing. And I don't know if those are going to change. They're not going to change for me. I think like I would probably be criticized from some who believe that it's wrong for me to say that my responsibility is to protect my family. That's ultimately my responsibility. And others would say, hey, that's ridiculous. Everyone should be personally responsible for that, irrespective of gender. So I do understand where Bill Maher's coming from. I've actually seen him live a few times, where I feel like that he oftentimes is kind of in the thick of really far left progressivism. And so he always feels, I think at times he feels the need to push back a little bit. So I'd imagine that's where that's coming from.
Yeah, it's funny because I've questioned myself a lot about what manliness means to me related to things like how I grew up and what my version of manliness from TV and marketing and all those kind of things. So for instance, I always talk about, when my wife and I go on a trip or when we even normally when we run errands, she almost always drives, which doesn't fit kind of that vision growing up of what a man is. A man is one who usually drives. On the other hand, sometimes I feel the most manly. For instance, when the weather is bad, my wife will turn to me and say, you know what, the weather's really bad. I'm having trouble seeing, can you manage this next 2 hours on our road trip? Because I
Interesting.
feel like I need extra help here. And to me, it almost comes down to being there for people when you need them. So that's how I've defined manliness for me. It's like I am there for my family when they need me. Like when the chips are on the table, I'm there. But it has nothing to do with gender, right? My wife could say the same thing. She's like, when
Yeah,
when
true.
when the chips are on the table, I'm there. But that's how I've decided to define manliness. Interestingly enough, a lot of this version for me relates to having children. And so I'm wondering, your platform is Modern Husbands. How much of this is people with kids? And does it change? Does your view of what being a modern husband is change when kids are in the picture versus not in the picture? You mentioned talking to Jay Zigmont, right? Which he has a platform based on people who don't have kids. So is the version for someone like Jay different than it is for us?
No, I don't think so. I think that all it does is it compounds the consequences of modeling and being there as a partner in your relationship. I one of my kids said to me a couple of weeks ago, when I was cleaning up after dinner. Again, I love to cook, love to smoke meat and grill meat, etc. Um, just an offhanded comment, because my wife went back to her laptop, that this is, I think one of my kids was like, Dad always is the one who does this. And another kid, one of my other kids, I have three, said, yeah, but isn't that what husbands do? Isn't that what
Hmm.
dads do? It was
Hmm.
interesting, was like I wasn't like intentionally trying to model it, but their perception is that, because I love to cook, like that's what dads do, that's what husbands do. So I think that like some of it is modeling, but I think that a large part of it is that in a house where both couples are working, it's more practical when you are with your spouse and you're a teammate, because it's so hard to parent. There's so many things that you have to do. The mental load of parenting is extraordinary. And if you can't find a system to put into place with your spouse to make the most of the time that you have, it becomes burdensome. It becomes overwhelming. And then your entire relationship is dominated entirely by your kids.
Do you think that this transition, this evolution to what we would call today being a modern husband, in a sense, has been spawned by the financial realities that have changed in the United States since the 1950s? I mean, basically, the financial pressures on couples are much more different than they were
Oh
60,
yeah,
70 years ago. In the 1950s, you could be a single man. In fact, as a man, you were more likely to get the job, more likely to make the money, more likely to be the sole earner. And over the decades, it became impossible that any sole earner, man or woman, was likely to be able to carry the family finances. So,
right.
by necessity, it became a two working family household. Do you think this has been a natural evolution, a natural transition because what we faced economically through the decades?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and kind of taking that one step further, where we are right now is that in 40% of households, women earn around the same or significantly more than men. And women are now outpacing men as college graduates at literally every level, 2 year degree, 4 year degree, master's degree. So this is a trend that's going to continue. Now, part of it was because of economic necessity. Even after economic necessity, there was still a significant gender pay gap. Fortunately, that gender pay gap is closing. In many cases, it's very close, depending on the career. It's very close to being closed for young females who are recently graduating in certain career fields. Um, and it's, like the lean in movement is a big part of that. But in order for a relationship to be strong, women may need to lean in at work to earn more, but men need to step in at home to do more.
Yeah, I mean, somewhat unrelated, but it definitely makes me think about it. As we're talking about this, you also mentioned earlier the push for college education. We see that women are generally achieving more, getting into colleges more, getting better grades. It's also the it's also the perfect time for men to lean into the trades, which is something we so badly need and
Absolutely.
actually pays well. One thing I don't think society is ready for yet, but I'm certainly ready for yet, is this idea of, look, if school is not your thing, instead of trying to take all these boys and high school boys that are being pushed to go to college, maybe we should start pushing you towards the trade, something that you might like more, something that you might be able to be very economically successful for, and something our country needs more, if that's just what the proclivities are, right? Women tend to be doing better right now in academics.
I could not agree more. And as a classroom teacher, I saw that, and I would always uplift trades, make sure that they were aware of what trades were paying well. I mean, some of them right out of high school. If you're in vocational schools right out of high school, for students who graduated from a traditional high school, they might need 6 months or a year, maybe a little bit more of specific trade training. But you're making great money in many of those instances right out of high school. Who is the dirty jobs guy? Mike Rowe. So I,
Yeah.
I would show Mike Rowe every semester, and we would always have a couple of lessons specifically on that. Beyond, we would just cover the silliness of believing that everybody should have to go to college. I have a disdain for that belief, because ultimately our first responsibility as parents and as people and as human beings is to be happy. Well, there's a lot of different ways that you can be happy. And if your labor of love is with your hands and you can do a hell of a job making great money with your labor of love, why would you want to ever talk anyone out of that?
I want to get a little tactical at the end of this conversation. We've been talking theory here. We've been talking about the different roles men play in relationships. But like I said, I want to get to specifics here. A lot of men are now faced with the decision. I shouldn't even say a lot of men. A lot of couples are now faced with the decision of whose career to prioritize.
Yep.
How, as a good modern husband, do we look at this decision and make the best decision for our families?
Uh, First thing that you should consider is the practicality of it. Actually, if you go to modernhusbands.com, we just released a free calculator, the Family Financial Planning Calculator, where you can input all of your financial information, and it will show you projections over the next 15 years based on that. So, for example, the Urban Institute released research that showed that for every year a woman has left the workforce to be a lead caregiver, she loses on average $295,000 of lifetime compensation because of compounding. Because in those early years, that's when you miss out on or you experience getting pay raises, or you'll get them later, or promotions, you're going to get them later, or the value of compounding. We all know the importance of investing as much as you can, as young as you can. Well, if you're not doing that because you're out of the labor force, that compounds. And so anyhow, the calculator will at least give you a financial picture for each of your careers so you can make an informed decision. But the other one really should come down to passion as well. I felt like that in our marriage where we were one of us needed to be the flexible one at the time. I had a big job at the time. I was after I left teaching to support my wife, and we moved to support my wife. I took on a different job that was big. She had obviously a big job, and we weren't financially poor. We were time poor. We needed one of us to have flexibility, and she was and continues to be really passionate about her career and advancing, and I wanted to support that. And I think that that's an important part of the conversation for spouses, is to figure out like who's really the ambitious one here. Not because society says you have to achieve certain things, because that's something that's really important to you.
Yeah, getting back to the Gardner and Rose model we talked about before,
Got it.
for men who grew up maybe with a little more of the traditional feelings about what they should be doing with their lives, about the gendered roles, about what being a husband is, maybe they're listening to us right now and saying, okay, it makes more sense for me to back off a little bit, take more of the family role, to be the gardener so that my wife can be the rose. How do we deal with that emotionally? Because it's one thing to do it, but then there's the emotional feelings of, I should be the quote unquote man. I should be making a lot of the money. Even if maybe we know better, how do we deal with some of those kind of maybe leftover emotional feelings that we grew up with, or that we think from society or marketing, or the influencers we know that we should be doing this?
Well, there's a couple things I want to point out, some very real feelings. First, that Pew released this research that found uh, that men don't necessarily believe that women need to be capable financial provider to be a good wife. However, women predominantly believe that men should be capable financial providers to be a good husband. So we're not all the way there yet. I don't want people to walk away from this podcast believing that men don't have to be financial providers. So the first thing that you need to do is to make sure that if you are not going to be the breadwinner, that your spouse does not devalue you. Otherwise, there's going to be turmoil, not just from how you're feeling inside, but how your spouse looks at you. And the second is to recognize that those feelings are real. Ed Combs is on our advisory board. He was the past president of Financial Therapy Association, and he went through this. His wife's a dentist. And here's this financial expert who's also a marriage and family counselor who went through real turmoil because for almost his entire marriage, she's been the breadwinner. And he was like me, raised in a little rural area where that's not what it's supposed to look like in a relationship. And it's not something that you can easily work through. You need to be open and honest with your spouse. There's a lot of like memes out there of like when a guy does a chore, how they won a trophy for it. But frankly, like when my wife gets home and the house has been deep cleaned, I took a half day from work to make sure everything was perfect. I kind of do want a little bit of trophy, a small trophy. So if you're a spouse, like it's important that if you're a woman listening to this, that you show your appreciation for your spouse for things other than the paycheck. You show the appreciation for the spouse who is the gardener and doing those things, and say how much you appreciate it, how much you value it, how much you respect it. That for me has eased. If any pain that was remaining, it's eased it when my wife does that for me.
I want to end by throwing a little bit of a hot potato into your lap. There have been some very definite spotlighting. There has been a very definite spotlighting of the modern marriage in this current presidential election. What have you heard from the people you work with, the people who use your platform, about their thoughts about the way our political system currently has been portraying the modern marriage.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously I don't go into politics with my website. However, I did recently point out that in this latest election, that there are two couples who I believe uh, putting a spotlight on these two couples does a good job sharing with people what I think a modern marriage looks like. The first couple, the obvious couple, is Vice President Kamala Harris and the current second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, who in his own right had a great career. He was a very successful attorney. But when you hear him speak, and this is what I love the most, he is so darn proud of his wife. He is so proud of her. And I think that a lot of modern husbands who see their wives crushing it in their careers feel this strong sense of pride and love because we know the happiness that that is bringing to them, but we also love them and we want the world to see how great they are. And then the other one, frankly, is Nikki Haley, and I believe her husband's Mark. And I know it was in the primary season, but he is in the National Guard. He was actually away from in Africa for much of her primary season, and he does the same for Nikki Haley. So I don't think that this is something where a conservative leaning person should believe that they should only focus on a traditional marriage. That's what defines a conservative. That's just not the case. That's not what we saw in Nikki Haley and her husband. And progressives right now, as we speak, they clearly have role models in Doug Emhoff and Vice President Kamala Harris.
Well, Brian, I wanted to thank you for coming on the show today. When I think about our conversation, I realize that being a modern husband and being a modern wife really are very similar nowadays. It's actually being a modern partner. We can look at today and say that, but when we look at the past, we realize that we've gone through years of the women's rights movement. We've gone through the years of women growing in the workplace, growing academically, and this is a change that's happened over decades and decades. But when we talk about becoming a modern husband, what we're really talking about is now many on the other side are trying to figure out how to adjust to this new reality and find new supportive, better roles. In other words, we're getting used to this idea of equality in a relationship, and it's just not something that was there in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And that's why I think your platform is so important, because it helps all of us adjust to what is a rapidly changing and expanding world. I want to end this episode the way I end every episode by asking you if people are interested in learning more about you, how can people connect?
Go to modernhusbands.com. So if you're at modernhusbands.com, you can find all of our social media channels there. We're active in all the primary social media channels. We have a free family financial planning calculator, and we have a toolkit which is robust, designed for busy dual career couples who are time poor that want to learn about how they can work together as a team to manage money in the home. And the toolkit is full of incredible wisdom from many of the national leaders in this space. So you can find the toolkit online there. And we have a podcast, which again, you can find at modernhusbands.com. And then the podcast, as you can imagine, focuses on managing money in the home as a team. And a shout out to you. This has been a great conversation. I thank you for having me.
Brian Page, thank you so much for being on Earn and Invest today. That's a wrap. Normally I give you a chance to say thank you, but you said the thank you before. So I leave things I leave things running just for first and foremost, let me just tell you, I leave things running just to catch a little bit of our after show. Just kind of that people hear what we talk about afterwards. I thought it was a great conversation, and I think it's such an important conversation. So, whenever you talk about the squishier issues, right, as opposed to talking about specifically finances and how do you budget and how do you do these things, you always take a risk, right? Because you're going to talk
Yeah.
about things that aren't easy to talk about, right? We're talking about a man's role in the world today. It's not going to feel comfortable, but they relate so much to money and it relates so much to happiness, um, that I think it's really important. So yes, the conversation went where I wanted it to go, where I planned for it to go. So yes, how did I do? Yeah, I mean, you answered to your knowledge, strengths, passions. And so, yeah, it came out to be exactly what I wanted it to be. I think it's a hard conversation to have. It's not, it's easier for you and I. Again, it's easier for you and I because we grew up with really strong mothers. So, growing up with a mother and without a father for a lot of my very earlier years, it's very normal for me to see women as everything, right? Even
Yeah.
even when it goes to like when I played baseball as a kid, it was my mom who got a mitt and would play baseball with me, right? So like my version of what being a man is very different based on my upbringing than a lot of people I grew up with.
Yeah, and it's super tense in when you start talking about like the political world because you've got what's the guy Jordan
Harbinger or no, Jordan Belfort, Bell
well yeah
Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson.
and Jordan Peterson who
Uh.
there are times where it's like yeah you're making a great point and then there are times where you're like geez oh and then Andrew Tate, like this toxic masculinity, which ultimately a lot of these things stem from the pain that boys from 18 to 35 are feeling right now who are not college educated, who are single. And those are the things that are dominating some circles of the conversation because of that. And it makes it uncomfortable. But then on the other side, like I'm trying to get a better understanding of how progressives also look at masculinity. So like Ed Freeman, his book Modern Masculinity, I'm halfway through Liz Plank's book, and like so much of it is like it's hard to relate to because it's just impractical to me. Like they're going into the kinds of depths where I think to myself, it's not that deep. It's really not. Like if you love your spouse and you guys look at yourselves as equals, it shouldn't be this hard to team up and figure things out. So that's why a lot of my responses are perhaps a little bit more vanilla than you might have expected. But I actually don't have lots of conversations about masculinity. That's why I was asking how I did, if that was what you were looking for.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it also hits me like right. I could see. So I obviously don't fall on the conservative spectrum, but I see why, not agree with, but I see why, for instance, the whole transgender issue makes people so irate. Um, but I think we're fighting that same fight
Yeah.
with the modern husbands movement, which is okay, we're not talking about men changing the way they dress, but we are talking about men doing things that traditional people do not feel are masculine behaviors and having women do things that were not traditionally female behaviors. And so to be angry at a transgender person is easy for a very conservative person because it's right out there in your face. But I think a lot of that anger is also just as alive in kind of the modern husbands movement, which again, people like you and I are like, it's just practical, right? It's just
Yeah.
we want to survive and live the best lives we can. And it's just easier and better and feels better and everything works better economically if you can have this outlook. But I think there are a lot of people who don't connect and see the world changing and don't like it on either side.